I know it's early in the year and we're just getting started with our literature, but we're going to tackle some really big questions this year, and perhaps none more bigger than the one we're about to address. Um, and when we think in terms of the course, it's not a course necessarily in religion, although we will deal with religious texts. We just can't escape that as part of a world literature survey course. But one of the things we need to look at and try to do so, I guess, in a mature and detached way, if we can, is that for many people throughout time, they struggle with the idea of the existence of a God or the role that God might play in their lives or in historical life or in the lives of their community. And so, we're not going to shy away from those conversations, but I think it's important to understand that our job is to just make sure that the questions get asked, and that we provide a look at what some writers, thinkers, historians, people from the past have provided as answers to those questions. So we're going to start with, I think, probably the biggest question of all, which is going to be that Theodicy question, which I kind of made an allusion to early on. And simply put, the Theodicy question, you can phrase it a lot of different ways, but for most people's satisfaction, it's the idea that if God is all powerful, if God is all beneficent, why do we have evil and suffering exist in the world? Why do innocent people die? Why do tsunamis strike and wipe out hundreds of thousands of people? Or why does something like COVID strike and seem to hit some groups of the population differently and harder than other people? And so how does religion try to address that or answer that question? And I think the book of Job is one of our first texts that we encounter in world literature that tackles that big question. It's a question that I'm sure that many people had, okay? It wasn't just the Hebrews who asked this question. All right, so when we think about this, all religions claim that there seems to be some sort of justice in the universe. Now, that justice may not be even. It may not be basically from a kind God. Definitely the God of the Old Testament is very different than the God depicted in the New Testament. And for some people, it's through their religion that they try to understand this question. And if they don't get the answer they think satisfies their need, they may abandon that religion or they may abandon that belief system. So we can look at the Theodicy question really in terms of a geometric triangle, okay? And think of it in terms as almost like a good old-fashioned trilemma, not a dilemma, but a trilemma. We tend to operate in things on a plus-minus basis, right? And we talked about this before in a previous lecture. But the idea that the world is composed of a dichotomy. There's good, there's evil, there's black, there's white, there's left, there's right, there's good, bad, you name it. We tend to put things on polar opposites of one another, and we realize that's not necessarily the fruitful way of going about looking at things. But if we look at it in terms of a triangle that's perfectly balanced, an equilateral triangle, in a balanced triangle, you'll notice your angles are all of equal measure, which means that the legs that make up that triangle are also of equal measure. So everything is in some kind of balanced harmony, okay? And the notion here, and it goes back if you're following our earlier lecture, the Hebrew Bible, along with the Egyptians, posited this notion that the world was created not in chaos, but in order. And with that idea comes the notion of equilibrium. And so what happened, if you want to go back into the Garden of Eden, is that equilibrium, that balanced scale, okay, of things was just coming unhinged and unbalanced. And so when it did, things weren't natural. The harmony was lost. So with the Theodicy question, we look at the three angles as being, or the 3 points that make up the triangle as being, one, the omnipotent being, or if you want to call that being God, that's fine, or Yahweh, or Allah, however you want to refer to it. That omnipotent being has the power to change things. We might think of that as omnipotence. Okay. Another part of the triangle, another equal end of the triangle, is that God is benevolent. He's kind. Okay. and he certainly is just. Okay? And so the notion that he's omnipotent and he's capable of loving mankind. And then third, we have to balance against this notion that things seem to happen that we don't ask for, that cause pain. Now, it's interesting to me that we tend to equate or connote pain with the notion of evil. Okay? So if you're experiencing pain, there must be some evil root to it or evil cause to it. It tends to be something we dislike and don't want, so we tend to shun it. Okay, so the idea behind the Theodicy question is, how do we square, if I want to make a little pun there, how do we square this triangle so that we have this balance? We have an all-powerful God who loves mankind and somehow can balance and make sense, or have us make sense of the suffering that happens in the world. Okay, so that's the Theodicy question in a nutshell, and there are lots of answers to that question, and I want to look at 5 particular responses that have generally been the 5 most dominant belief systems. You may fall under one of these or you may not. There certainly are others, but we're just going to deal with these 5. And the first answer to the Theodicy question is one that we would categorize as denial. Okay, human suffering occurs, but it's not consistent with the idea of an omnipotent, benevolent deity. In a sense, we're almost asking, like we're putting the wrong angles or points to our triangle. The response of religion is not to describe the deity as good or omnipotent. Those are human terms. God is just simply God. Suffering is something that's a part of life. Okay, God has nothing to do with that. In a way, if you want, this might be akin to the view of the deists, the idea that God is kind of like a watchmaker who creates this big whirligig of a complicated system and then lets it off and basically steps away from it. Okay, and the best example of why this might be true is you have the Holocaust and other genocides, these incredible examples of human suffering and people who are innocent being put through things that no one can really imagine themselves going through. And so human suffering is definitely inconsistent with this idea of a just and benevolent God. So that's the first approach. And most people either accept this notion of deism or they fall into this notion of atheism, where it negates the possibility that there is a God for them. Okay, which brings us to the second idea to try to make sense of that. And that's this notion of what we might call dualism. Okay, and the dualist notion is one that says the world has good and evil. And if you want, this dual nature is God is on the side of the good, and you have an evil force. And if you want to call that evil force Satan, or if you want to call that evil force, like Loki in Norse mythology, or if you want to think of it as a karmic idea, okay, or this idea of karma, the idea that you have this yin and this yang, okay, that are different sides, okay, the black and the white, the struggle between good and evil, and so that these two forces are in constant struggle with one another. So we do have a benevolent deity, but he's not quite an all-powerful deity. There's an equally powerful malevolent force. I don't know if you want to call it a counterweight or an evil force, but that is the force that's responsible for the suffering. So the virtue, the goodness that happens falls under the realm of God, and the evil that happens falls under the realm of Satan. Okay, in a cosmological sense, this makes sense and probably is the belief system adopted by a lot of people, is that we need some kind of balance. We need that. We call it a dichotomy. You might want to call it a duality, okay, between these two systems. All right. And then we have our third and kind of like our halfway point, okay, and that is the notion that when we think about human suffering, there's really no such thing as an innocent person. Okay, so if we go back, and this is what's taught in some religions, definitely some Christian religions as well, is the notion that all humans are guilty. We're all guilty by virtue of being born. And you might tie that to that notion of the sin of Adam and Eve. Okay, so Adam's sin that notion of what we call original sin. The vestige of it is still being carried on in us. And we basically pretty much deserve what we get, okay? It's because of our sinful nature that bad things are happening to us. And so this idea is that our pain is caused, in one sense, by our own selfishness. This is the role that Job's friends take. This is the ancient vision of things, is that you will see pain in your life. You will see visited upon you. You will see punishment visited upon you as a result of your sin. You may not be aware of it, and you may try to hide it from others, but it's there, okay? With no truly innocent being, we don't need a benevolent deity, to kind of intervene. We're all guilty. It's simply a matter of God's grace in which we come out of our pain, in which we come out of our sinful nature. Okay? So again, this notion of original sin is very prevalent in this particular one. All right. So let's move down to the fourth one. And that is that sin and suffering is a result of a possibility for us. There's some kind of transformative power in the suffering. It's a transcendent, salvific is the word we're looking for. Gods are all powerful, and good people can indeed be innocent, but salvation is something that you have to earn. Okay, salvation is something that exists outside of the earthly realm. So yes, you're going to suffer here, okay, but it helps you understand, it builds your character. It is through your suffering you come to realize your sin, and it is through your suffering that you have an opportunity to seek and receive God's mercy. All right, and then the fifth and final look that we have here is going to be what we call duration, okay? And this is the notion that suffering is only a temporary state, okay? It's a little bit like a pain, a broken arm, a toothache that you might experience, but it's the notion that the world that you live in is temporal. It is not eternal, okay? And the idea that there's some kind of heaven or some kind of blissful place that's outside of your earthly existence and experience, you will be rewarded for your suffering in this life by having a place in the next. And this fits for a lot of people. This is the notion that there's an afterlife. There's maybe a transmigration of souls where you're moving up some kind of ladder, but the notion is that it gets better for you. Suffering is only for a little while, and so the clock is ticking, but you will soon be rewarded for your pains.